Evil can't be seen. By the time it is recognized, it's already too late. The motives for evil are as diverse as its manifestations, and they can often be monstrous. So are evil people sick or monsters?
It's not only sick people who commit evil deeds. I would even say that they are in the minority.
So what is evil? What role does aggression play? Is it the accelerant for a destructive force that has always lain dormant in each and every one of us?
I don't think that evil behavior as such actually exists. In this respect, we need to rethink a little.
But what controls our behavior? How free is our will? What role do our genes and our environment play? What course must our biography take for evil to break through? Does the life of a perpetrator provide explanations as to why a young man killed 77 people?
The deed doesn't justify talk of a perpetrator development, but we can learn a great deal from Mr. Breivik. We just have to understand what.
Norway, July 22nd, 2011. In the government quarter in the capital Oslo, a bomb exploded, killing 8 people. It was the horrific start to a day of mass murder, which cost a further 96 lives on the island of Utøya. The tragedy shook the little country to its very foundations. The perpetrator was 32-year-old Anders Behring Breivik. He saw himself as a crusader, as the messenger of an ideology which he hoped to spread worldwide. Breivik wanted to attract maximum attention.
This need included media coverage because it was vital to him to become, in a certain way, a shining light of history. And to be honest, we must say that Mr. Breivik has gone down in the annals of criminal history. That is why he is not anonymized in reports. We all know his name. And the media, of course, were an important instrument for him.
As an expert, Nala Saime answers the questions of how far, indeed, if at all, a perpetrator can be made responsible for his actions. The focus is always on the legal evaluation of the facts. But it's also about assessing the special features of a case to obtain general knowledge about evil.
In exemplary fashion, Breivik reveals the basic conditions for a pathologically excessive and highly destructive narcissism, with the aim, so to speak, of completing history. From the life, the personal biography, of an outsider.
If someone recounts the story of a perpetrator's life, does that not make them his tool?
A man in Norway kills 77 people. It seems hard to me not to talk about that.
Mass murder as the inevitable result of biographical failure? An explanation of such simplicity would not deal justly with the crime or the victims. Yet the different stages in the development of a human life contain a horde of events which scientists are striving to recover. 69-year-old Daniel Zaguri is a criminologist, forensic psychiatrist and author. He began his career as a court expert. In France, he progressed to become an expert on terrorism. He often encounters evil in the garb of seemingly normal behavior.
We all intuitively think that the most appalling crimes are committed by the mentally ill, by massive psychos, by monsters. But reality shows that those involved in terrorism, genocide and many other crimes are quite ordinary people who, in the broadest sense of the word, are perfectly normal and certainly don't have any mental defects.
D'une normalité au sens très large du terme, en tout cas, pas d'une pathologie.
Anders Breivik was born in 1979. His parents separated not long afterwards, and he was brought up by his mother. Theirs was a difficult relationship right from the start.
What is interesting about Breivik's childhood is that it involves a transgenerational problem. Because even Anders Breivik's mother was rejected as a child. Her mother suffered from polio and vented all her rage, disappointment, and despair on her daughter. So Breivik's mother herself had never experienced acceptance or loving kindness in a family scenario. Yet this woman later became pregnant.
Breivik's mother complained about the child while she was still carrying it, and even considered an abortion.
Anders Breivik actually came into the world as an unwanted child. His mother rejected him, but as an infant, of course, that is not something you can comprehend. You are directly dependent for affection on the primary attachment figure in your life.
The boy grew up with his mother. Outwardly, he lived in a protected environment. But behind the middle-class facade, chaos prevailed. The mother couldn't cope and wanted to give Anders up for adoption. He then spent the weekends with foster parents until his mother put a stop to it. The rejection motif was to be repeated throughout his life.
We have to be careful not to reconstruct things in retrospect. After a crime has been committed, it is always easy to say that the deed can be traced back to this or that event in the perpetrator's life. I can, for instance, talk about my experiences with serial killers. It's extremely rare, indeed almost impossible, for a future serial killer to have grown up in a home with a fire in the grate and lots of hugs and kisses from his mother and father.
So what role does childhood play? What is determined biologically? What is genetically inherited? For a long time, the suspicion prevailed that evil lies in our genes, a case of unchangeable information, a kind of genetic predisposition, in other words.
We know today that it's not only of interest which gene or genetic variation of a person has in their body. What really matters is whether this gene is active or inactive.
But what does active or inactive actually mean? It's here that a young science called epigenetics comes into play. It involves molecular mechanisms which read our genes with varying intensity. So does this mean that evil has nothing to do at all with the genes themselves?
It could well be that we carry a certain set of risk genes within us. But that doesn't mean that these genes really will come into play, because they may not all be active at a certain point in time. In the field of epigenetics, we are focusing on the question of whether there are any environmental factors that could influence these genes.
Eva Unternehrer works together with Anke Köbach. They know that traumatic experiences influence genetic activity. But that's not the only finding epigenetics has come up with.
The big question is, how do certain experiences burn themselves into our epigenetic memory? Indeed, is there any such thing as an epigenetic memory? And if so, can we change it by means of therapeutic measures?
It was long assumed that a child is only influenced by its environment after it's born. Today, we know that influences which co-determine how genes are activated already have an effect on an unborn child.
Everything we have learned about the pregnancy phase indicates that it is extremely important with regard to how our stress axis is constructed. And if the mother experiences more stress during pregnancy, to a certain degree, this is also transmitted to the child.
A person's genotype is determined when fertilization takes place. However, during pregnancy, it is completely erased and then reactivated. This complex process shapes our character and our later behavior. How our genetic stamp becomes active seems to be dependent on our living conditions.
There might, for example, be certain toxins that can specifically switch particular genes on and off. And it could also be the case that emotional neglect in childhood changes a whole raft of genes.
What's also certain is that no one comes into this world a perpetrator.
What's also really important to know is that no single event which happens during pregnancy can make a person an evil perpetrator or a victim in the course of their life.
Anders Breivik was 4 when his mother moved into a new apartment with him and his half-sister. It was a friendly environment with lots of children, but Anders' mother still couldn't cope. She turned once again to the youth welfare office to find a foster family for Anders. His preschool teachers were worried about the boy. Disgracefully aggressive was one comment. They also said that he had no friends, yet couldn't amuse himself. Other children claimed that Anders mistreated animals, and other children as well. The youth welfare office thought that the family's problems should be placed in the hands of a psychiatrist. 6 years his elder, the boy's half-sister left the family at an early age and now lives abroad.
At first, I think Breivik's sister looked after him, but at some point, of course, she had her own life to live and left the family. That's only natural. And there is no way that full responsibility for running the family can be placed on the sister's shoulders. In those initial years, I think she played a relatively substantial role, especially when the mother was unable to take care of her family because of her own psychological problems.
In 1983, the family was examined for several weeks in the psychiatric center in Oslo. Doctors found that the mother was suffering from a borderline personality disorder in combination with angst and depression. They found that her attitude towards her son was erratic, that she lived in her own world, and that she was unable to think clearly in stress situations. "I wish you were dead," she once screamed at her son. Doctors recommended that Anders be placed in the care of a foster family, but his mother put a massive resistance to the withdrawal of custody. She hired a lawyer. Against all expert advice, the Youth Welfare Office dropped the case.
I think the boy should have been taken out of the family, and most resolutely, and the authorities should have ensured that the new setting would have enabled a bond to develop.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
According to experts, childhood is one of the most important building blocks in a person's biography. It is here that the basis for our further life is created. So are these the years that can turn someone into a killer?
If I systematically signal to a child that it is bad, then that will become its perception of itself. But you cannot say this will make it develop into a perpetrator. What it does show, however, is disaster does not arise of its own accord.
Virtually all serial killers have experienced disastrous developments in childhood. But what is the distinction here between cause and effect? From the mid-1980s on, Leszek Pikalski probably murdered more than 80 people.
The aim through the act of killing is to gain a feeling of self-affirmation and to recreate the experience of being worthless in someone else. When I kill them, my victims have no value. So it's no different from me squashing a fly against the wall.
Pikalski's mother became pregnant with her son after being raped. He grew up in the Polish countryside. Despised herself as the bride of Satan, Leszek's mother rejected her son. In the village where they lived, he was only ever referred to as the bastard. His mother put the boy in a home and disappeared from his life.
We have seen that these people either continue to idealize their mother or they neutralize the image they have of her. Despite all the incidences of abuse, rejection, torment, and all the other brutal things you can think of, they continue to idealize her. but it seems as if all the murders are a form of transferred matricide, even though at the same time the killer adheres to this idealization and neutralization of the maternal image.
After 4 years in a home, Leszek Pikalski returned to his village to live with his grandmother, who tormented him and his sister, pressing their hands on the hot plate in the kitchen for the slightest misdemeanor.
The
grandmother's approach to upbringing can only be described as sadistic. I have known several cases in which this problem of an unwanted birth played a role. It is relatively certain that anyone growing up in such circumstances will not turn out to be a great feminist.
They are more likely to end up like Jack Unterweger, who murdered at least 10 women. Young Jack grew up in his grandfather's house in the countryside in the Austrian province of Carinthia. The man was a brutal drunkard and cattle thief. Jack never met his father, who was an American soldier. His mother was a prostitute who disappeared from his life when she was sent to prison. Living with his grandfather, Jack went to seed, physically, but above all mentally.
Das ist der Boden für eine tiefe emotionale Verrohung.
That is the foundation for deep emotional brutalization, coupled with a very early stamp of a negative view of women. Because basically women are whores.
Weil Frauen sind im Grunde in Anführungsstrichen Huren, und diese Zuschreibung funktioniert ja nur.
And this imputation only works if you have an extremely patriarchal view of society.
Sicht auf die Gesellschaft überhaupt haben.
Leszek Pikalski and Jack Unterweger, two brutal killers with childhood biographies characterized by abuse and a lack of emotional support. Such childhood experiences don't automatically make someone a killer. However, they do constitute the basis of a destructive development.
J'ai travaillé en prison. Quand j'étais jeune, c'est pas celui où...
When I was young, I worked in a prison. Statistically, it is not the sort of place where you will find people who grow up in a carefree and loving environment. So, from a statistical point of view at least, education and emotional conditions play an important role in early childhood.
Et affective de la petite enfance.
When we are
loved and cared for, when we are caressed and fed, when we received positive emotional signals, in this emotional resonance phenomenon. Biologically, we are talking about the release of oxytocin. We learn that we are someone who is loved and is a good person, and that we are wanted.
But why do some people develop into perpetrators, while others who have grown up in similar circumstances don't? What impact do certain factors have on the criminal development of a person's biography?
There are certainly some people who, even under the most extreme stress, do not change their personality to such a degree that they become aggressive and criminal.
At the Max Planck Institute of Experimental Medicine in Göttingen, Germany, Professor Eichenreich and her team are carrying out research into the impact of environmental factors in childhood and adolescence. For the first time, it has now been proven statistically that an accumulation of risk factors can contribute to violence and criminality being displayed as an adult. The team focused its research on urbanicity, physical and sexual abuse, migration and drug consumption.
In my opinion, one extremely important discovery is that, basically, even risk factors are interchangeable. In other words, we can concoct any cocktail, irrespective of whether it is a combination of birth trauma, migration, cannabis, psychotrauma, sexual abuse, and alcohol. It makes no difference which ingredients are in our cocktail. The result is an extremely enhanced risk of someone reacting with aggression and criminality as an adult.
If 3 of those 5 factors are applicable, the probability increases to up to 50%. It plays a major role if this impact occurs before the age of 17, because up to then, the brain is highly vulnerable in its development.
I think it is extremely important to transfer this information and say that if a person reveals 1, 2, or 3 of these risk factors, irrespective of what they are, then we must be on our guard and think about how we can intercept the consequences.
In Anders Breivik's case, nobody intercepted any consequences. In Oslo, at the age of 13, he embarked on a career as a sprayer and tagger. He wanted to belong. In those early teenage years, it was already clear what would characterize his life up to his crime. He wanted to play with the big boys, not only to be in the group, but also one of its leaders.
Actually, he was always an outsider. He always made every attempt to join a group, but most people noticed that there was something strange about him and didn't want anything to do with him. To some extent, they didn't take him seriously, or they even found him spooky and kept their distance.
At this time, Anders Breivik had friends who tagged with him. But basically, the tagging scene made fun of him, laughing at his ambitions, the way he walked and the way he dressed. He just didn't fit in. In the end, the tagger gang turned against him, and so did other people he knew. He was always the odd man out, his friends said after the killing spree. At some point, they'd simply had enough of him.
Sozialer Ausschluss ist
Social exclusion is one of the worst experiences an adolescent can have. It is incredibly hurtful and can have massive consequences for a youngster if he can't balance out his social exclusion with positive experiences.
balanciert werden kann durch gute Erfahrungen.
But Anders Breivik too lacked a stable family life. After he had been arrested several times for obtaining spray cans illegally and for tagging, his father permanently broke off all contact with him. In addition to the effect of environmental factors on humans, scientists at the Max Planck Institute of Experimental Medicine in Göttingen, Germany, are studying the degree to which aggressive behavior lies in our genes. It's a broad field.
Over the last few years, we have focused specifically on just a few genes and drawn up mouse models which show a genetic change in 1 or 2 of these genes.
In manipulating suitable candidates in an animal mode, attention is paid to whether aggressive behavior is intensified. In this way, researchers want to find out if a certain gene really does control aggression. The researchers apply a special mouse experiment known as the resident intruder paradigm.
This means that we have a mouse living alone in a cage. Suddenly, it finds another mouse has been placed in its cage. We then observe how the resident becomes violent when a young, cheeky male mouse suddenly moves in.
Of decisive importance is how long it takes for the mouse to attack the intruder. The assumption is that male mice with the manipulated aggression gene will attack more quickly than others of the same species. The one mouse is not happy that the intruder is lying in its bed. It's not immediate, but slowly the intensity begins to build up. Now they're wrestling. Soon the researchers will have to intervene. The experiment is stopped before one of the animals gets hurt. The object of the experiment is to determine the number of genes which influence our behavior. The advantage of the mouse models is that the results can often be applied to humans. With both mice and humans, researchers are interested in the expression of a gene, as it's known, the process by which genetic information is translated and made usable in the cell as protein.
We studied one gene, MECP2, in the mouse and were able to determine that it really is associated with aggressive behavior. When the expression of the gene, the protein volume, changes. And we really did succeed in showing that this gene, when it changes its expression in humans, produces greater aggression.
Generally speaking, aggression is an important and constructive characteristic. It serves the formation of a community through assertiveness, leadership, and demarcation. And in both humans and animals, if the ability to act aggressively is lacking, survival itself can be threatened.
A social structure is actually created through individuals with differing levels of aggression coexisting and establishing a hierarchical order. This is important, for example, for a joint strategy for survival. In other words, this all plays an important evolutionary role.
In animals like these chimpanzees, brutal aggression is rarely unmotivated. Rank, territory, and mating rights are fought over. But such conflicts rarely have a fatal outcome. In competition situations, dominant male chimpanzees display the same physical reaction as male humans. The aggressive behavior is regulated by the sex hormone testosterone. So is evil a male characteristic?
As an extremely diplomatic answer, I would say that aggression is easier to identify in males. Going for one another, fighting, or as in the case of the mouse, attacking a rival, is more of a male reaction. You might say in reply that some women even box. Indeed, they do. And this means developing a certain degree of aggression, because in sport too, aggression is important. If your aggression is inhibited, you won't be able to box. But that is certainly not the prototype.
Les hommes sont impliqués.
Men commit violent crimes. The more crimes there are with no violence, the more women are involved. Traditionally, they have been associated with poison. That was always the woman's weapon.
Le poison était l'arme des femmes.
Aggression becomes a problem when it becomes hostile and massively infringes social or personal boundaries, generating shock and disbelief when it impacts on a victim with a brutal lack of inhibition.
Successful aggressive behavior, which enables me to reach a specific goal, is undoubtedly linked to a certain pleasure gain. Not in the sense of sadistic delight at having harmed someone, however, but more of a feeling that I can achieve something in this world. I am effective and I am independent, and I don't need to put up with anything.
Und ich bin autonom und ich muss mir nichts gefallen lassen.
Professor Svenja Taubner from the University of Heidelberg works with so-called antisocial adolescents. She treats young people who have attracted attention through their disturbed social behavior. This also includes violent crime and aggressive behavior.
There's no way I want to be a victim. That is a central issue for the adolescents in therapy with me. On no account do they want to become a victim. Victim is a dirty word, and so a certain degree of strength has to be shown. That is also massive motivation to commit crimes or display aggressive behavior.
Research into the brain helps scientists to understand the mechanics of violence in adolescence. The brains of those young people prepared to resort to violence reveal different activation patterns from those of non-violent adolescents. In order to test this, in a scan, they were shown different situations, some of which were threatening. In cases of extreme threat with non-violent adolescents, a kind of shock-induced paralysis set in, which initially allowed them to assess the situation. But the adolescents who were ready to use violence reacted differently.
The aggressive young men didn't have this shock-induced paralysis. The activation here shows that they would go straight into reaction mode. They would either flee or fight.
Where do we have to start to prevent a pathological development in aggressive adolescents? In addition to biological factors, social factors in particular favor the risk of disturbed social behavior. Difficulties in early relationships, neglect, abuse.
The
best intervention is family therapy, working with families and intervening at as early a stage as possible.
Und das, was man eben am besten machen kann,
The best thing to do is to give adolescents and children a feeling of self-value, acknowledgement, and the ability to be able to perceive others and themselves in an empathetic way.
We have all encountered evil at some time or other, but it remains abstract. It can't be measured, it can't be categorized or grasped. It changes its appearance, adapting to what we want to understand of it. Often, not even the person doing evil recognizes it, even when the evil is inside them.
For a doctor, evil is basically a series of destructive modes of behavior, which a person doesn't think about because they themselves don't see them as evil. It is extremely rare for evil to claim to be evil.
I don't really believe that there is such a thing as evil action per se. So in this respect, we need to rethink a little. Each person acts in their reality or in their biological conception in a specific way. Science, however, is absolutely central with regard to why a certain mode of behavior seems to be the best option to a certain person at a certain point of time.
Science focuses on the dark side of a person's character. At the University of Koblenz-Landau, cognitive psychologist Professor Benjamin Hilbig and his colleagues have even developed a kind of measuring instrument they call the dark factor. The theory behind it is that all dark characteristics of a human being have a common denominator.
Basically, this common denominator is the tendency to maximize one's own advantage at the cost of someone else. This is done partly by ignoring the harm they have suffered.
One particular finding of the dark factor is that more unites egoists, Machiavelli persons, narcissists, psychopaths and sadists than separates them.
First and foremost, what is really part of this dark factor is that a person is absolutely full of himself. He believes that he deserves more than others, but there are many other convictions which justify such behavior. I might believe, for example, that the world is evil, a vile place where everyone is fighting for himself, so that's what I have to do. Basically, I have to protect myself from the others who only want to exploit me anyway. I might also believe that there is no such thing as justice, so my behavior can't be evil or wrong. All these are convictions that justify forms of behavior which a person might perhaps not show otherwise.
To determine the level of a person's dark factor, Professor Hilbig relies on questionnaires and behavioral experiments like the dictator game. Test persons receive a certain sum of money and normally unobserved have to share it with an anonymous stranger.
This can be seen as an extremely simple way of determining how egoistic or altruistic a person is. Basically, the test persons are free to divide up the sum as they wish. And we don't know in each individual case how they have done this. But this sharing out really does take place. Another person does receive the money, so everything is genuine, so to speak.
Experiments like the dictator game have a long tradition in behavioral research. And on average, the result is always the same. Around 1/3 of the test persons divide up the money equally. And in some rare cases, even give more than half. Another third gives something but less than half. And the final third keep everything for themselves. Coincidence?
When you consider which modes of behavior are evident in this game, then each, I think, can be explained. I can say, why not? The money's here, and for now it's mine. Why should I give it away? I think it's plausible to reason like that, especially when it corresponds to the views you hold. You can equally say, my goodness, I've got to be fair. Or you might want to opt for a middle course. For example, it would be nice to be fair, but on the other hand, I've got the money, I've got the power, so I deserve a bit more.
The dark factor doesn't claim to measure evil. It establishes a value for dark personal traits. But is it not really a bit evil for someone to keep most or indeed all of the money for themselves?
It is not evil. Many economic models, in fact, would say it is simply rational. But we can also say that it's not fair, and it's not what most normal people would expect. So if you ask someone what they would expect to find in the envelope, then most would say some money.
There is only one person who can decide whether his behavior is justified, the individual himself.
One of our central needs is to have a positive image of ourselves, to be able to say that what I am doing is acceptable. My actions serve a certain purpose, and this purpose is good and proper. And as long as we can claim this about ourselves, we are also in a position to display behavior which could possibly be seen by others as harmful or even evil.
Developing a positive self-image is one of the biggest challenges facing adolescents. Anders Breivik changed school several times. After being cold-shouldered by the taggers, he was regarded by many fellow pupils as a loser. He was an outsider.
What I find important in his case is that this rejection was so problematical because he seems to have had a relatively high opinion of himself. Only then, of course, is rejection or failure a problem. You see this with out-and-out narcissists. They function superbly and don't have any problem as long as they are successful, as long as they find acknowledgement. But if that is lacking or if they are not successful, then things like depressions threaten.
His last school, a commercial secondary school, also proved to be a dead end. Breivik left without any qualifications, but he had other plans anyway. He started a part-time job with a telemarketing company. Even now he was moving in a grey area of law, as it was described later. School no longer seemed important to him. He had also found and joined a new group. Breivik became involved in the right-wing populist Progress Party, the party which opposed the tagger scene he had once wanted to belong to.
Es geht darum, das zu bekämpfen, was einem Kränkung beigebracht hat. Das ist das Entscheidende.
It is about combating what caused you pain. And if this party had caused him pain, he would have moved on to yet another party and then fought his previous one.
Es geht immer darum, das zu bekämpfen, was man als
So it is always about combating what a person imagines has caused him suffering, as a kind of mighty ruler passing the last judgment, so to speak.
Für, ich möchte sagen, das jüngste Gericht zu sorgen.
At this time, Anders Breivik was quite successful in his job, albeit not always legally. Within the space of a few years, he had earned a sizable amount of money online with forged US diplomas. But he was close to being arrested. What's more, he had lost his last financial reserves on the stock market, and in his party he had not even been considered for a leading position. Rejected once again, Anders Breivik moved back in with his mother.
Das ist relativ typisch, wenn äußere Lebensbezüge zusammenbrechen.
When external elements of someone's life collapse and they are faced with failure once again, it is typical for radicalization to be chosen as an exit strategy. Such people have to reorientate, but they can reorientate. They can burn all their bridges. There's actually nothing more to hold them back.
Over the next 5 years, Breivik rarely left his room, often spending entire days on the internet. He rarely met up with old friends from his childhood. He told them that he was collecting articles on the Islamization of Europe, but then he even broke off those contacts. The internet provided him with the fuel for the world of ideas in which Breivik was moving at the time. Over the first few years, he played excessive online games, but now it was very specific websites he was visiting.
In the majority of cases, it's offline radicalization. It's your group of friends co-radicalizing each other. In a minority of cases, it's social interaction online. The idea of someone just watching videos without any interaction whatsoever or reading books without any interaction, the few cases that do exist, we can't say for sure that there wasn't other people involved. We just don't know if there were or were not.
But how does radicalization work? To find out on behalf of an international consortium of scientists, Nafis Hamid spent 2 years carrying out research in a jihadist milieu.
part of what radicalization does is it gives you agency again. It makes you feel important. It gives you purpose. It gives you a direction. It gives you action. It gives you identities and values. It gives you a community that you may not even see around you, but you're led to believe that 100 years from now that community exists and is going to reward you for your heroic actions that you're doing today.
What makes a person ascribe to radical ideas, to kill for them, to put his own life on the line, to place his own agenda above the well-being of others? Researchers claim that the value system of radical terror sympathizers is askew. Like most of his kind, even a jihadist has so-called sacred and non-sacred values which play a major role.
Sacred values are values that probably most people have. Any moral conviction that you really strongly believe in could potentially be a sacred value. For some people, freedom of speech is a sacred value. For other people, civil liberties can be a sacred value. It's any value that you would not negotiate on and you would never violate. And when people perceive their sacred values to be under threat, that's when they're willing to fight for those values.
But what happens exactly when a sacred value is threatened? One answer why the jihadists who were examined were prepared to commit extreme acts for their cause is revealed by a look into their brain.
When they were thinking about their sacred values, what happened was that you had decreased activation in an area of the brain that's associated with deliberative reasoning. So when they thought of their sacred values, deliberative reasoning went offline.
Sacred values are non-negotiable, but maybe the way they are acted out is. These values also seem to be important in the evaluation of terrorist attacks. Here we see that not every operation is supported by all Islamists.
So the Bataclan attack was not as popular amongst sympathizers. It got a lot of backlash. In fact, right after the attack, I think there was something like more than 50 jihadist groups that signed a letter saying we condemn these attacks.
But that wasn't the case with regard to the attack on the Paris offices of French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, when 2 Islamist assassins murdered 12 people.
We did all these surveys on sacred values just amongst normal Muslims in Europe. And the one value that was always sacred, regardless, even the most peaceful person, the most pacifist person, was we should never draw cartoons of Prophet Muhammad.
Anders Breivik became more and more radical. He now had a new mission. He spent days and nights surfing websites which reflected his crude view of the world. He tried in vain to establish contact with the leaders of the scene. Rejection once again. He was a hermit who expressed his hatred of the world in a 1,500-page manuscript.
Generally, you see overall fewer lone actors than group actors. And we haven't yet seen who the radicalizing milieu could have been, whether it was online or offline. And that's also very rare. That's kind of exceptional. Usually you're able to find a mentor or someone who's co-radicalizing, a friend.
The fact that this kind of perpetrator is not the rule, but no longer the exception, is shown by the case of Stefan B. from Halle in eastern Germany. He failed in his attempt to commit mass murder in a synagogue. Instead, he shot dead a woman in the middle of the street and a man in a kebab takeaway. In initial interrogations, Stefan B. expressed right-wing extremist and anti-Semitic motives. He described himself as a loner, saying he'd never had friends or a girlfriend. He was, quote, a discontented white man.
Quand vous regardez les biographies,
when you look at the biographies and the writings of mass murderers, it's most surprising to see that they all say the same thing. I've had a rotten life. Women have never been interested in me. I've lived in a nightmare.
There are alarming parallels between Stefan B.'s life and that of Anders Breivik, a young man cut off from society who lived with his mother in a room with the door permanently closed. Stefan B. also found his right-wing extremist view of the world confirmed in anonymous internet forums and, before committing his crime, left behind a manifesto. A lost biography? an inevitable development? Experts are of a different opinion. They believe there can be a turning point in everyone's life which changes everything. But that wasn't the case with Anders Breivik. He rented a farm outside Oslo and prepared to carry out a crime he had spent years planning meticulously. He purchased several tons of artificial fertilizer, using it to make various explosive charges. He honed his body, he took steroids, he practiced shooting, and he also trained how to react with minimal emotion when the day came. But can empathy be switched on and off like a lamp?
Wir wissen es aus einem ganz anderen Bereich von den 9/11-Attentätern.
We know from a totally different case, that of the 9/11 terrorists, that in his will, Mohammed Atta, for example, had stated categorically that it was essential not to think of other people, because that would stop you carrying out the deed. So assassins definitely calculate what kind of a situation they might encounter that would prevent them from implementing their plan. They prepare mentally for this contingency.
Breivik killed many of his victims face to face. He showed no sympathy. At the end of the day, 77 people were dead. A killer like Anders Breivik is quickly regarded as mentally ill. His crime seemed simply too monstrous. And indeed, an initial assessment diagnosed schizophrenia, an evaluation which caused a furore among the people of Norway.
We are talking about a man who had planned his deed for years, announced it, and then carried it out meticulously in 2 phases, and in doing so sought maximum publicity. So, from a legal and medical point of view, with such organization and continuity involved, I find it impossible to say that the deed can only be explained as a mental disorder. That is out of the question.
Que l'acte peut seulement être éclairé par la maladie mentale. C'est pas possible.
And the Norwegians didn't accept the initial diagnosis either. It was an acid test for the stricken country. Its liberal population were stunned by the medical assessment. Can a perpetrator not be criminally liable because of mental illness, even though he planned the most evil of deeds in great detail over many years?
Sie haben auch Menschen mit einer Persönlichkeitsstörung, die im
In normal civil life, there are also people with personality disorders who are a pain in the neck, but manage to get by. In normative terms, what is of interest in a constitutional state is the degree to which a person's ability to cope with life is inhibited by their personality disorder. And I must say that Anders Breivik had a relatively large number of valencies, including all his deception campaigns. So he coped very well in life. He had the potential to handle his life differently in some way or other.
The court ordered a second expert's report, and it came to a different conclusion. Breivik was criminally liable. He was sentenced to 21 years in jail to be followed by preventive detention. Our legal system is based on the concept of free will. This assumes that, as a rule, a perpetrator consciously decides to commit a criminal act. But is this system still in keeping with the times? Or do we need to take new findings in the fields of genetics and epigenetics into account in assessing and sentencing an offender? In the past, there have already been several court judgments in which genes played a role. In Italy, for instance, a killer was given a lighter sentence because an expert's report confirmed that he had a predisposition towards violence. But what role will biological factors play in future?
Ich halte das für dummes Zeug.
I think it's ridiculous to give someone an MRI scan and then say, he couldn't help doing what he did. You then have to ask, what else wasn't he capable of in everyday life? And I can be a gambling addict and rob a bank and be not criminally liable because everything else in my life has gone awry. And I have a personality differentiation as a result of this addictive process, which doctors regard as so pathological that it has to be compared with schizophrenia. But criminal law operates in such an individual way.
Up until a few years ago, the voices of experts claiming that evil was to be sought in our genes were a lot louder. Today, even leading scientists take a more rational view.
I think that the level of aggression can be influenced genetically, but so many other genes are present which have a protective effect. In other words, they modulate the degree of aggression through other characteristics, so that we can certainly not say, if a person has this gene, he or she will become a killer. So in this respect, I would be very, very careful. I hope and believe that judgment will never be passed on a person solely on the basis of genetic information.
Evil is invisible, yet it has many faces. Today, it's going into hiding more and more, forming groups or radicalizing itself in its own cut-off world, and then, in individual cases, suddenly re-emerging in the form of lone wolf terrorism with fatal consequences for the victim. But how can a modern democratic state protect itself from evil?
Radicalization reduces complexity. That's what makes it so attractive. I believe that the biggest challenge for complex societies lies in enabling people to live in these complex societies and have an inner compass within these societies. And that means making people emotionally mature.
What can we do for our children? Give them something, perhaps. Give them the capacity for rebellion. Teach them to be themselves and not to renounce that. Not to melt within a group the moment history calls for its murderous collective impulses.
There is no clear recipe against evil. Step by step, science is decoding its biography, its origins, its forms, and its motives, in order to be able to intervene before evil strikes.